With the American Civil War beginning in 1861, the need for new weapons and new ships exploded during this time, the Confederate States and the United States alike. Now back to the Revolutionary War. A small one-manned craft named the Turtle was constructed, the world's first submarine. Several attacks were made using the Turtle, but all attempts failed. The world had yet to see a submarine sink a ship. With the Civil War raging in 1861, both navies were looking for a new weapon to have an advantage over their enemy. The USS Alligator was ordered in November of 1861 and launched in May of 1862, while the Confederate States Navy began work on their own submarines. Horace Lawson Hurley provided funding for James McClintock to design 3 submarines: the Pioneer, built in New Orleans, the American Diver, and Hunley, both built in Mobile, Alabama. The Pioneer was the first tested in February 1862 on the Mississippi River. It was towed to Lake Pontchartrain for testing, but with the advance of Union troops toward New Orleans, the Pioneer was scuttled. Another submarine that we have no historical documentation for was also scuttled at the mouth of the Bayou St. John, where it meets with the lake. Now, after this disaster, construction began on American Diver in Mobile, Alabama. William Alexander of the 21st Alabama Infantry Regiment was to oversee the project. Experiments with electric and steam propulsion were tested, but ultimately they resorted to a hand crank as the propulsion method. The American Diver was painfully slow, but nonetheless it was towed towards Fort Morgan. An attack was made on the Union blockade, but the submarine sank in the heavy seas caused by poor weather and the currents at the mouth of the Mobile Bay. The crew escaped with their lives, but the submarine was not resurfaced. After the loss of the American Diver, construction began on the Hunley. Legend has it that the Hunley was made from a steam boiler, but this is not the case. She was designed for 8 crew members, 7 seats for crew to sit to turn the hand crank ducted propeller, and for 1 to captain and steer the sub. Each of her ends had ballast tanks that could be flooded with water and hand pumps to empty them. The hand crank propeller was equal to around 3.5 horsepower. More ballast was added by bolting iron weights to the hull. In the event of an emergency, the nut could be removed, causing the extra weight to fall off from inside the ship. She had 2 watertight hatches at either end. The hatches were 16.5 inches wide and 21 inches long. The hull was 4 foot 3 inches in height, making her very cramped and impossible to stand up. She was finally ready for testing in July 1863. She successfully attacked a coal boat in Mobile Bay. The submarine was sent by rail to Charleston, South Carolina on August 12, 1863. Once she arrived, she was seized by the Confederate Army. Her builders would remain involved in the further testing and maintenance of the vessel. She was never officially commissioned into service, even though she is sometimes called the CSS Hunley. Confederate Navy Lieutenant John A. Payne from the CSS Chicora volunteered to captain the Hunley, along with 7 sailors from the CSS Palmetto State and a Chicora. On August 29, 1863, a test dive was made. During this, Lieutenant Payne accidentally stepped on a lever to control the diving planes when he was moving on the surface. This caused her to begin a dive with 1 of her 2 hatches still open. Lieutenant Payne and 2 other sailors escaped, but 5 of the men drowned. Michael Kane, Nicholas Davis, Frank Doyle, John Kelly, and Absalom Williams, the first lives taken aboard the H.L Hunley. The Confederate Army took control of the vessel. All orders had to come directly from General P.G.T. Beauregard. Lieutenant George E. Dixon was placed in charge of the Hunley. On October 15, 1863, during a mock attack, the Hunley failed to surface. All 8 on board were killed, including the financier Horace Hunley, along with Thomas Parks, Henry Beard, R. Brookbanks, John Marshall, Charles McHugh, Joseph Patterson, and Charles Sprague. The H.L Hunley was raised once again. Her crew was removed and buried. The initial explosives the Hunley was supposed to carry was a floating explosive charge with a contact fuse called a torpedo. During the time she would approach an enemy ship while towing the torpedo behind her, she would dive under the ship and surface on the other side. The torpedo had a contact fuse, so all the Hunley would have to do is keep going until the torpedo struck the side of a ship and exploded. This plan was discarded because of the danger of the towed torpedo being caught in the Hunley screw or drifting into the Hunley, so she would attack with a Spar torpedo instead. A Spar torpedo was a bomb placed on the end of a long pole that is attached to the submarine, sometimes having a barb on the end so it would stick into the wooden hull of the other ship. A fuse was used to detonate the black powder. The Hunley Spar was 22 feet long, and she would have 135 pounds of black powder in a drum attached to the spar, mounted on the bow. She would be 6 feet under the water, ram the spear into the side of the ship, hopefully lodging into the hull. A line was attached to the torpedo so that the Hunley could safely back up and then detonate the torpedo, ultimately sinking the ship. That was the plan for the Hunley. But after the deaths of the last test mission, General Beauregard ordered that she could no longer be used to attack under the water. An iron pipe was attached to her bow and angled downwards so that the torpedo could be delivered underwater without diving. On the night of February 17, 1864, the USS Housatonic was stationed at the entrance of Charleston Harbor, 5 miles offshore, a 1,260-ton wooden steam-powered sloop of war, equipped with 12 large cannons, commanded by Captain Charles W. Pickering, with a crew of 150 men. With the Confederates desperate to break the naval blockade, she was sent on her first and final mission, commanded by Lieutenant George E. Dixon, with 7 volunteers: Frank Collins from Virginia, Joseph Ridgway, Maryland, James Wicks from Florida, Arnold Becker from Germany, John Carlson from Denmark, C. Lumpkin from Britain, Augustus Miller from Germany. 4 men American-born, while 4 were European-born, all fighting for the Confederate States of America. Accounts differ greatly about the Hunley's initial approach onto the Housatonic, but she was spotted just before the spar embedded the torpedo on the hull of the Housatonic. She was unable to fire the cannons at the Hunley since she was too close at the time the Hunley was spotted. Small arms fire rained down upon the Hunley. The spar struck under the wooden ship, attaching under the hull. A few moments later, the torpedo detonated. Some first-hand accounts from the crew of the Housatonic say no sound of an explosion was heard aboard, but she began to sink. With the crew panicking, they started climbing the rigging and trying to enter the lifeboats. She began to sink stern first, and she was listing to port. For years it was unknown what happened to the Hunley during this time, but at the time a report was given that a signal had been seen from the Hunley. A post-war correspondent stated the signal was supposed to be 2 blue lights. The lookout on the Housatonic claimed to have seen a blue light on the water after the ship sank. But after the ship was recovered in modern times, it is unlikely that this was the case. We will go over later why. The Housatonic sunk in just 5 minutes, killing 5 of her crew, 2 officers, and 3 men, making the H.L Hunley the first ever submarine to sink a warship. Survivors were rescued from the other blockade ships in the harbor. The USS Canandaigua was the first to arrive. The Hunley never returned after the attack, and the Union lines were too close to send a rescue mission. So the fate of the Hunley was not known for over 100 years. On August 8, 2000, at 8:37, the Hunley was raised and resurfaced for the first time in 136 years. Conservation of the sub has been going on ever since that day. She was found on the seaward side of the slope where the Housatonic had been sunk. All evidence and modern analysis points of the instantaneous death of the crew at the time the torpedo detonated. Once the silt inside the Hunley was removed, all the crew members were found still seated at their stations. The scientists discovered the pump had not been set to drain the ballast, so it was believed she was not flooded until the crew had died. Evidence had been found of a copper sleeve at the end of the Hunley spar, indicating that the torpedo may have never left the end of the spar when it exploded, meaning the torpedo was around 16 feet away from the Hunley at the time it exploded, ultimately killing every crew member instantly. Just like the pumps, the keel blocks had not been detached from the hull. Many relics have been discovered aboard the Hunley. It was always legend that Dixon was given a $20 gold coin by his sweetheart when he left the war, and during the Battle of Shiloh he was shot, and that the bullet had struck the coin in his pants pocket, absorbing the impact and saving his life. This legend ultimately was proven when the gold coin was found laying on the hip bone of Dixon, the precise place where it would be if it was in his pocket at the time of his death. It indeed had been struck by a bullet, and traces of lead were found on the coin. It had an inscription written on it: Shiloh, April 6th, 1862, my life preserved, G.E.D. In 2002, a diamond ring and brooch were found sifting through the sediment at Dixon's Station. They were found in the remaining fabric of his vest pocket. The gold ring with 9 diamonds and the brooch with 37 small diamonds. This jewelry would have been extremely valuable during the war. A Union ID tag was discovered, causing much speculation. The tag belonging to Ezra Chamberlain, a soldier on the Union side. It is unknown whether Ezra was aboard the sub, forced to be there as a prisoner of war, or a Union spy. But DNA evidence proved this false. Joseph Ridgway was the soldier with the ID tag, and both men had fought on opposite sides at the Battle of Morris Island in 1863. Ezra had died at this battle, so it is believed that Ridgway saved the ID tag as a war trophy. A signal lantern was discovered. It was clear, so the blue light that was seen the night of the attack could not have been from the Hunley. Buttons were found, a bandana, 8 canteens were found aboard, 16 shoes belonging to the men. Dixon's gold pocket watch was found, a brass oil can, pieces of suspenders. Dixon's silver pocket knife was also found. With all this gold and silver aboard with Dixon, it proves that he was a fairly wealthy man. The ship was lit with a candle, and this was also found aboard the Hunley. Many incredible artifacts were discovered alongside of the men, as well as the men themselves. They all sat on a bench in front of the hand crank, and Dixon sat in the front where he steered the ship. The ship was extremely cramped for the 8 men, with no source of fresh air. The men had to use the air sealed into the submarine. A test was conducted before the mission to determine the amount of fresh air that the crew would have. The candle that they had lit burned out after just 30 minutes from lack of oxygen. But the men stayed on the bottom for 2 hours. Everybody on land believed they were dead and would have to salvage the sub yet again, but they survived the test. They had 2 hours of air once they were sealed in. The crew's remains were laid to rest April 17, 2004 in the Magnolia Cemetery in Charleston, South Carolina. They were all buried with full Confederate honors. When the Hunley was recovered, signs of damage were found. There was a large hole in the aft ballast tank. It is unknown whether this was from the night of the attack or from sitting in the seabed for so long, from repeated hurricane strikes, from the currents, or just time. The rudder was located underneath the keel. It had broken off sometime while the sub sank. On the front conning tower, there were 5 portholes, so Dixon could navigate. One of the portholes was completely missing. The missing piece was found in the bottom of the submarine in the sediment. It is believed this could have happened the night of the attack. The 2 hatches on the ship were intact. One was locked and the other was unlocked. It is unknown whether or not this was from the crew trying to escape, but unlikely since all the men were found at their stations. The 4 main theories about the sinking of the Hunley are as follows. Theory 1. And this is the most likely option in my opinion. The explosion from the torpedo kills the crew members, and the ship drifts a short distance to its wreck site, where it slowly fills with water. The crew never sent the signal back to the island, because they had all died instantly. Theory 2. The submarine got stuck out at sea and could not travel back against the tides. Being a hand-crank driven submarine with the equivalent of 3.5 horsepower, strong tides could have kept the Hunley from returning to the island. The crew did plan their journeys so that they could ride the ebb tide out, and after the mission, they could have survived and tried to make it back, but the tide stopped them. So they could have settled on the bottom despite Beauregard's orders not to go under the submarine. They were spotted when they attacked the ship and could not just stick around on the surface. If they couldn't make it back despite the orders given, Could they have sunk to the bottom to avoid the gunfire or capture? Could the heavy breathing from the turning of the hand crank and the heightened anxiety of battle cause them to use much more air than anticipated, causing them to run out of oxygen and slowly die of asphyxiation? Or could they have gotten stuck on the bottom and just ran out of air, and that is why the one hatch was unlocked? Theory number 3. A collision at sea. As the Housatonic sunk, the USS Canada raced in to pick up survivors. Could the wake from all the ships sunk the Hunley, or could one of the ships unknowingly have ran into her, sinking it? The ships were moving very quickly to get to the scene. They might not have even noticed if they impacted the sub, but this could have been deadly to the Hunley, causing her to take on water, slowly drifting to her final resting place, causing some of the damage found upon her 2000 rescue. Theory number 4. A lucky shot from the initial small arms fire from the Housatonic. Could a lucky shot from one of the sailors on board the Housatonic struck the porthole, causing it to break and to be found in the bottom of the submarine? The viewports were the most vulnerable place in the submarine. Dixon was right behind the glass, and he needed it to see to attack the ship. They were supposed to be in blackout mode, so no light could be seen from any unexpected ships. Could the candle have still been lit and light visible from the porthole, and the soldiers that spotted the Hunley at the last minute making a perfect spot to aim for, right at Dixon? Although no injuries were found on any of the skeletons of the men, a flesh wound could have killed Dixon or incapacitated him, causing the sub to slowly sink through the flooding water in the porthole. The broken porthole does support this as a possibility, but the pumps were not used and the ballast was not released. The most realistic option for the sinking, in my opinion, is the crew all died instantly from the explosion. The torpedo detonated too close to the sub and they were killed instantly. The second most likely option is the submarine retreated but could not make it back in the current and died waiting on the bottom for the current to die down. And that is the story of the H.L Hunley, from her building to her demise. It is absolutely incredible how industry changed during the Civil War. We went from single-shot, smoothbore muskets to repeating rifles in a short amount of time. The war caused us to build things that had never been built before. The first Gatling gun, the first ironclads, the first rotating turrets, and the first successful submarine to ever sink a ship. There's something fascinating about this. In the 1860s, a submarine actually sunk a ship. It's even more incredible that back in the Revolutionary War, they actually tried with a wooden submarine. Ultimately, the Turtle did successfully go on a mission, but the torpedo basically bounced off the ship. It was coated in copper, bounced off the ship and exploded harmlessly away. But that is incredible. A submarine in the 1700s and a successful attack in the 1860s. The Industrial Revolution and the Civil War itself is just incredible how far we came in just a short period of time. And even for the Confederates to complete this submarine is just boggles the mind. They did not have a large budget like the US military had. They were blockaded. They couldn't get much trade in or out. Cotton was stacking up at the ports and all the goods weren't coming in. So they were desperate enough to put people in an iron tube and put them under the water and attack the blockade. And people were willing to do that. That is back when men were men, as it is said. And if you've ever seen the documentaries about the rescue of the Hunley, they do a lot more justice than I do. All the artifacts that were found, all the care that goes into lifting this ship so nothing changes. It is exactly like it is the day that it sunk. And they have been going at it since 2000, still to this day, preserving the ship and everything in it that was in it. It is absolutely incredible. Just think about yourself. It's 1863. You're on the Confederate side. You're doing alright during the war at this point. Things haven't shifted so drastically, but you got Union blockades that are basically starving your whole population. You need them gone. And somebody comes up with the idea of a submarine, an iron tube in 1863 that they're going to flood with water so you can go under the surface and ram into another ship with a big spear with a bomb attached to the front of it. And you hope that you can pull it off and then ignite the fuse and not blow up yourself. The history is incredible for the Hunley and the people that died trying to make this happen. But that's the story of the Hunley. A shorter one, but a good one, and I hope y'all enjoyed. We could go on and make so many different videos about all the different achievements that were made during the Civil War. There's so many of them, and especially the Confederate side. They didn't have the money. They didn't have any of the moolah that the U.S. government had, and they had to work with what they had and with the little help that they could get from Britain, because they did get quite a bit of help with production from Britain, but not for an entire submarine. They did that on their own, and they did that and succeeded ultimately, even though it did end in the death of every man on board. And the leap forward that was made from the 1860s to World War I, when they had all these submarines traveling across the entire world. The leap in just that short period of time, nearly 50 years, and the differences are astronomical. A great story, and I hope you enjoyed it. And we'll see you on the next one. Peace.